the comments by Bjorn Lomborg and Jordan Peterson had pressing relevance for where we are today when they wrote, and I quote, "The meaningful exchange of truly diverse ideas and perspectives has withered over recent decades. We need to foster and promote critical thinking and constructive discussion," unquote. Well, on this issue of AUKUS, there has been little critical discussion. The Prime Minister, via senior right and left faction power brokers, managed to have inserted into the Labor Party's Nation platform last weekend a 32-paragraph statement on AUKUS. The Prime Minister promised 10,000, quote, secure, well-paid, unionised jobs in South Australia and promised to inspire, quote, a world without nuclear weapons. This was a last-minute deal. There are many people on both sides of politics and amongst the punters who are not in love with all this language of war. They would argue it's easy for these politicians who would never pick up a gun and go into combat. They expect others to do it. As always, the business world is silent. Fear, as we've seen with coronavirus and climate change, spiced with a liberal dose of untruths, wins the day. Senior Labor ministers at the conference warned that China would have 21 nuclear submarines and 200 major warships in the water by 2030. Pat Conroy is the Defence Industry Minister, a left faction power broker, and he attacked those who supported what he called a Robert Menzies appeasement. Now, Conroy is a factional ally of Albanese. He was heckled by ALP delegates over the alleged $400 billion cost of the submarines. Conroy was accused of taking Australia to war. Conroy said AUKUS is, quote, a progressive policy that would deter conflict and, quote, protect our people by adding strong defence capabilities on our own. Mr Conroy said, the central question for delegates here is how to prevent war. The truth is, he said, strength deters war, appeasement invites conflict. He said, if you are pro-human rights, you need to be pro-AUKUS. If you're pro-peace, you need to be pro-AUKUS. If you're pro-advanced manufacturing, you need to be pro-AUKUS. He said, this is in the national interest. The Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, who led negotiations to get them over the line, said, quote, we're witnessing the single biggest conventional military build-up in the world since the end of the Second World War. He said, quote, in the year 2000, China had 6 nuclear-powered submarines. By the end of the decade, they'll have 21. He said in the year 2000, China had 57 major warships. By the end of this decade, they'll have 200. He said these are not our decisions, these are not our choices, but this is the world in which we live, and it is our unavoidable obligation to navigate our way through it, unquote. Out there, the voter, if my correspondence means anything, expects government to navigate itself away from war without that being described as appeasement. It is fair to say that dozens of Labor branches passed motions opposing the AUKUS commitment. I should say that under AUKUS, the AUKUS deal, Australia and the US and the UK, hence AUKUS, they will share nuclear propulsion technology with Australia, and our Navy will acquire at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines armed with conventional weapons to be built in Australia. Or so they think. That's what they're talking about. If you are to believe what you're told, and I'm not sure I do, this is about acquiring, operating and eventually building nuclear-powered submarines. The argument in favour is allegedly record investment in defence, skills, jobs and infrastructure. When you talk about the cost of $400 billion, with that money you could give $1 million to every resident of Geelong, Hobart or Wollongong and have some left over. You might recall that when AUKUS was announced in September 2021 by the former Morrison government and now adopted by the Albanese government, the former Prime Minister Paul Keating described it as, quote, the worst foreign policy decision by a Labor government since the attempted introduction of conscription during World War I. Mr Keating argued that, quote, a contemporary Labor government is shunning security in Asia for security in and within the Anglosphere. Said Paul Keating, any Prime Minister that shops Australia's prerogatives and interests to another power will always be feted and celebrated by that power. Tony Abbott, on the other hand, argues that Mr Keating is, quote, seriously wrong about AUKUS and the submarine project and about the rapidly intensifying strategic competition from the government in Beijing. But in a veiled concern for this expensive AUKUS arrangement, Tony Abbott did say, quote, obtaining a nuclear-powered submarine from Britain or America was an option I wish had been available back in 2015. Once my preference for quickly obtaining Japanese submarines off the shelf had been torpedoed by the cargo cult politics of South Australia. Says Tony Abbott, Keating is quite wrong that Beijing means no harm to anyone. Tell that to the Uyghurs or to the people of Hong Kong, whose suppression was economic self-harm that Beijing was more than happy to endure in the pursuit of national aggrandisement. Well, this is central to the point I made earlier. We've become a nation of one idea. The world of debate has passed us by. We don't have a contest of ideas. Oppose the response to coronavirus means you're automatically anti-vaccination, no matter how many times you've been vaccinated. Oppose climate change and you're a conspiracist or a denier. Paul Keating, of splendid intellect, expresses concern with AUKUS and is attacked from all sides. Surely over what will be more than $400 billion we need debate.